Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Jenifer Van Vleck, an assistant professor of history and American studies at Yale. She is an historian of 20th century U.S. and international history. Her research and teaching focus on U.S. foreign relations, with particular emphasis on the ways in which culture, technology, and private enterprise have shaped the United States' role in the world. She is also interested in transnational approaches to the study of empire and imperialism, modernization, and globalization. Today we'll talk with Professor Van Vleck about her new book, Empire of the Air, Aviation and the American Ascendancy, for which she was awarded the MacMillan Center's Gaddis Smith International Book Prize for Best First Book. Welcome, Professor Van Vleck.
Thank you, Marilyn. I'm pleased to be here.
So let's start with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
So my book uses aviation as a lens onto the United States' rise as a global power in the 20th century, from the Wright brothers' first flights in 1903 through the jet age. And the book focuses primarily on commercial aviation, but military air power is also a significant part of the story, as I can explain a little bit more later. And so the book is really kind of has two kind of parallel stories, or interconnected stories, I should say. One is the diplomatic history of aviation and the role of the airplane in U.S. foreign relations, particularly in terms of the expansion of American commercial power. And then the other story is about the cultural history of aviation and the ways in which ideas about aviation inspired Americans to imagine the world and the United States' place within it in new ways. And today, when flying is basically like riding an airborne Greyhound bus, it's kind of hard to imagine a time in which aviation captivated the public imagination in the way that it did in the mid-20th century. But in the period of time that I look at, so basically the early 1900s through the 1970s, aviation really had kind of transcendent significance. And especially because this was an era in which flying was very expensive, it was considered a luxury and had kind of connotations of glamour, and people were fascinated by it. So even though only a small minority of people could actually afford to fly, discourse of and images of aviation pervaded American culture in advertisements, in film, in newspapers and magazines. And so my book really examines kind of the cultural history of aviation as a way of understanding how Americans came to terms with and kind of legitimized the United States' expanding global power. So beyond the story about aviation, it's really a story about the United States' rise as a global power, and a particular kind of global power at that.
Right. Okay. And what led you to write the book?
So I should say it was not a direct flight. It was a rather circuitous route. So as you said in your introduction, my primary research interests concern culture, business, and technology in the history of U.S. foreign relations. And so when I was in graduate school, I had to write a seminar paper for this course called The American Century, which was taught by my advisor, John Christophe Agnew. And right before, in the process of choosing my seminar paper topic, I happened to see the movie Catch Me If You Can. And as a cultural historian, I was really fascinated by the kind of the iconography of air travel as depicted in that movie, and that has been depicted in subsequent TV shows such as Mad Men, for example, and ABC's now canceled series Pan Am. So I started to become very interested in the history of Pan Am. First of all, why did this one airline have such an incredible cultural allure during this period of time? But then I was also curious about why Pan Am was called Pan Am, because that name implies some kind of connection to Pan-Americanism, which in turn implies a connection to the history of U.S.-Latin American relations, which was also a topic that I was interested in exploring. So I wrote this paper, and I found out that indeed Pan Am first expanded its routes throughout Latin America in the 1920s and 1930s, and had a very complex and interesting relationship to U.S. foreign policy in that region. So from there, I started to think about the relationship between aviation and U.S. foreign policy more broadly. And I realized that even though there's a massive popular literature on aviation history, at that point in time at least, aviation was really kind of marginalized in historical scholarship. It was considered a subject that was of interest to buffs, not serious academic historians. So I really wrote this book with the intention of changing that, with the intention of emphasizing that looking at aviation really can help us develop new perspectives on big questions in international history and American history.
Right. So that leads me to the research itself. How did you do the research? What was your methodology?
So there are, I used 3 main bodies of sources. The first was government documents, primarily State Department documents, but I also did a lot of research in presidential libraries to basically understand the kind of the foreign policy side of the story. The second group of sources were cultural sources, so advertisements, films, novels, newspapers, and magazines from the United States and other countries. And again, this was a way of understanding how people were talking about aviation.
That seems like the fun part of the project.
It was definitely the fun part, especially working with the advertisements, because the imagery is just so rich. And I was lucky to have access to, at Duke University, they have a very large collection of advertisements and records from the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency, which was one of the most influential agencies in the U.S., and they did advertising and publicity for a lot of major airlines. So that was a really wonderful archive to use. And then finally, my third body of sources were the records of Pan American World Airways, or Pan Am, which is really kind of the main protagonist of my book. And it's usually very difficult to get access to corporate records, but fortunately, after Pan Am went out of business in the late 90s, or the early 1990s, they donated their records to the University of Miami. So I was able to go and look at those. And of course, Miami was a very nice place to do research, especially in the winter.
Okay. So let's talk about some examples of how the commercial aviation during this time period helped the United States rise in terms of globalization.
So in two main ways. One, aviation literally expanded and strengthened the kind of the material backbone of American power in the world, both militarily and economically. The United States' worldwide infrastructure of air routes and air bases facilitated global commerce. Obviously, it enabled new and more powerful methods of warfare. And it literally allowed the United States to have a larger kind of global footprint. In many nations, Pan Am, especially in the 1920s and 30s, Pan Am's sales offices served as kind of informal embassies. And then on the other hand, aviation, as I've said, also really changed the ways that Americans thought about their nation's role in the world. And especially because the visual iconography that aviation inspired allowed people to think about the world as one, as a kind of unified global space. So images of air routes, for example, allowed people to kind of picture the world as interconnected, first of all, and also the world as kind of a single object of influence for the United States. So it suggested that American power could go everywhere. It suggested that there were no limits to that. But, and this is one of the crucial arguments of the book, is that even in kind of expressing this kind of new expansionist imaginary, the discourse surrounding aviation basically denied that American expansion had anything to do with traditional forms of empire. So the idea was that whereas European empires were territorial and involved conquering land and ruling over populations, the United States would have an empire of the air, which would be based on markets and access to commerce. And in my book, I argue that in many ways was a fiction, because airplanes obviously need airports. They need massive resources and tracts of land, and the United States had a very large territorial footprint in the world, but still it was a different kind of empire. So aviation helped to reconcile Americans' traditional anti-imperialist sensibilities with their nation's growing global power.
So Pan Am was the first airline, basically, is that correct?
The first U.S. international airline, yes.
So, and they basically were flying to South America, Latin America countries, and is that because the president was Latin American?
No, so here's the interesting thing about
Okay.
Pan Am that most people don't know. So most people, when they think of Pan Am, they think about the president, Juan Trippe, who is this kind of larger-than-life, very colorful character. And despite his Hispanic first name, he was a WASP through and through. He was actually, he was the son of a banker, grew up on New York's Upper East Side. He was named after one of their families, an aunt, but only by marriage. So he had no connections to Latin America. But he also did not found Pan Am, and this is what most people don't know. The airline was actually founded by a trio of military officers in 1927. And they were concerned about the security of the Panama Canal, because this was a time in which a number of airlines in South America had German and Austrian backing, and they were worried that these airlines could potentially jeopardize the security of the Panama Canal. So they wanted to have a U.S. airline in the region to, first of all, protect the canal, but then also to uphold the Monroe Doctrine that the United States is supposed to be the dominant commercial power in the region, and it's closed to further European influence.
Okay. So in addition to back in the 50s, the first consumer flight, I'll call it a consumer flight, where average people, although probably upper class average people, were taking these flights. So they were going predominantly where in the world?
So I'll back up and say another reason why Pan Am started in Latin America was that airplanes didn't have the technology for transoceanic or
So
at least
they don't have
transatlantic
fuel
or
or something like that?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So the earliest flights were actually from Miami to Havana, Cuba, and it was called the cocktail circuit because this, of course, in the late 1920s was prohibition, and so people were flying to Cuba basically to party.
Right.
But by the end of World War II, of course, airplanes had developed the technological capacity to fly worldwide. So by the mid-1950s, especially with things like the introduction of tourist fares, which did make flying more affordable, Americans were really flying everywhere. I mean, of course, you know, the transatlantic market was the most competitive and most traveled market. But aviation did a lot to basically create kind of new tourist destinations, especially in the post-colonial and the developing world.
Okay.
And Pan Am in particular was instrumental to that because in addition to the airline, the company owned the Intercontinental Hotel chain, which kind of specialized in creating kind of modern American-style luxury hotels, you know, in places like Africa and, places that didn't already have that kind of tourist infrastructure.
Right, wow. Very interesting. So during the research, what was something that perhaps was most surprising to you that you didn't expect?
Two things. I mean, I think certainly the extent of military air power in the history of commercial aviation. I mean, I knew obviously there's a connection, especially on the level of funding and the ways that technologies develop, but I certainly didn't expect to find that Pan Am itself had been founded by military officers with an explicitly military purpose, or one that aligned with kind of military strategy.
Right.
And so when I began the project, I very much thought that it was going to be about commercial aviation because air power has a very large literature of its own. But I realized that the two histories are really deeply intertwined. And then the other thing, which is kind of funny, I didn't expect that airline passengers in the 1940s and 50s complained about air travel just as much as we do today, for somewhat different reasons, but especially in the immediate post-war period, the nation's kind of airport infrastructure just could not handle the volume of passengers at the time. So, so things were happening like, planes were having to circle airports, for up to an hour before they could land, and and there are all kinds of articles in magazines like Harper's and Time and Life, like, why is flying so miserable? And it's just, it's funny.
Wow,
I mean,
that's
because
great.
we now remember that period kind of nostalgically as this golden age of air travel.
Exactly.
And in many ways, it certainly was more luxurious in terms of, basic things like, you were served a real meal and a martini and things like that. But especially the physical experience of flying was not as wonderful as we often think it was today.
Very interesting. So Pan Am ended up going under in the early 1990s,
yes.
correct? Do you think it was because it was originally founded on the military aspect of air travel, aviation. Do you think they, missed the boat along the way in terms of the commercialization of air travel?
I think the real issue has to do with the changing relationship between the airline industry and the state. Okay. So basically, until 1978, when President Carter deregulated the aviation industry, airlines depended heavily upon government subsidies to operate. And so the so-called legacy airlines, airlines like Pan Am and TWA that had routes all over the world, they were never really financially sustainable without those kinds of subsidies. Okay. So after the Airline Deregulation Act, they couldn't really compete with these new low-cost carriers, many of which operated with non-union labor. And so I think, I suppose that you could make some arguments about kind of the ways in which commercial aviation started to have kind of less strategic significance, but I think it really has to do more with regulation and deregulation and those kinds of changes. Okay, all
right. And so what do you conclude in your book?
So I conclude, first of all, that aviation is a really important element of the story of U.S. foreign relations, and one that is often, I think, unfortunately overlooked.
I agree. When you think about how important the air travel and bringing people to places that they have never been before, I agree. It's I think it has been missed.
Yeah, and I think that especially because it was so culturally popular, and it had this kind of rich cultural iconography and discourses surrounding it. I think the history of aviation is a really good way to understand how Americans have envisioned the world, and that's essentially what the book is about. It's a history of the American global imaginary. And the reason why I wanted to examine this is that around the time that I began working on the project, a lot of historians were pursuing transnational projects that, rather than looking at the history of a single nation, as historians have traditionally been trained to do, there's a lot of new interest in scholarship that not only looked at relations between nations, but aimed to understand the nation state itself in historical terms. And yet I saw in a lot of that work, there was often a kind of reflexive tendency to throw around terms like transnational or global without really unpacking the ways in which those terms came to signify what they do. So what I wanted to argue is that the term the global, the very ways that we imagine the world, those are historically constructed. Just as the nation itself is the product of history, so too is the conception of the global that has driven American expansion in the 20th century. So I wanted to trace the origins and the meanings of that concept.
Very good. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
For more information about Professor Van Vleck and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.